What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sit Down. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet. We're living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time. I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another sit down video. Also, if you enjoy cigars, I'm not sure why you haven't done it yet, but make sure you check out our signature sit-down cigar available with Pravada Cigar Club. The link to buy is in the pinned comment below. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get into another very interesting organized crime topic. And over the last several years, Sammy Gravano has told many stories here on YouTube, from his time in the mafia, even to his time in prison after he was indicted for selling narcotics in the 2000s. One name we have heard mentioned several times by Sammy Gravano is of a man called Cornfed, aka Paul Schneider. At one point, Paul Schneider was regarded as the most dangerous inmate in the California prison system. The question is, did he actually befriend Sammy Gravano inside the ADX federal prison, dubbed the Alcatraz of the Rockies? Let's get into Sammy's prison pal, the story of Paul Cornfed Schneider, next on the sit down. I will say this: Paul Schneider has one of the most unbelievable stories I have ever looked into. It is bizarre. It is taken through twists and turns. It involves everything from guard dogs to pepperoni pizza to knives stuck up certain things that you would never think they'd be stuck up. Let's get into it. Paul Schneider was born in 1962 in the great state of California. Now, it's unknown where exactly Paul Schneider is from. However, it was said by his sister, who would eventually develop cancer, that Paul Schneider and her were raised by a very abusive stepfather who regularly abused Paul on the regular. Now, his sister would also say that their stepfather would SA her on a regular basis. She would say one thing, though, about her brother. They always maintained a relationship, and that Paul Schneider did whatever he could to protect her, but he was just too small. Eventually, though, as a grown teenager, he would regularly attack his stepfather for all the abuse he had taken. Paul Schneider was, for one thing, a very dangerous person, though his childhood basically grew him up to be a criminal. By his early 20s in 1985, Paul Schneider would commit one of his first crimes. He would be arrested after he robbed armored guards coming out of a grocery store of nearly $100,000. Now, it was said that Paul Schneider's stepfather would eventually find out about the caper after he used Schneider the $100,000 to purchase a motorcycle. He would then go home and the stepfather would report him to the police. He would be sent to New Folsom, which is a very well-known state prison in California. Schneider would have to face the real fact that, as we know, in the California prison system, he would gravitate towards gang culture. And to impress, in 1987, the Aryan Brotherhood, who we've talked about on this channel, according to an AB dropout called Robert Rowland, it was said that Paul Schneider would stick a CO and was given a life sentence and sentenced to time at Pelican Bay, where he would remain for a long period of time. Now, Paul Schneider in 1990 would be called by an attorney called Philip Cousins to speak at a trial in Sacramento. Now, he was a validated member of the brand, and that is a no-no. However, he was subpoenaed, and Paul Schneider had no interest in testifying. According to what we know, Paul Schneider would be ferried to a Sacramento court in and around 1990. He would be in a hallway with an attorney called Philip Cousins. Cornfed would produce a 9-inch blade which was said to be in his rectum. He would then take the blade and stick Philip Cousins, who was a defense attorney, 4 times. Now, the defense attorney, Philip Cousins, would survive. However, this would be yet another crime that Mr. Schneider would get from inside prison. He would ultimately decide to plead guilty. However, he did have one asking price for the judge to prevent a trial. Schneider would ask for 2 pepperoni pizzas and soda for he and his cellmate to devour, and in turn, Schneider agreed to plead guilty. He would be hit with yet another life sentence. Now, subsequent to his second life sentence, he would eventually, though, sue the state of California for extensive x-raying, which I don't quite understand how he won. However, according to state records, he would be given $11,666. And after reading some sort of magazine involving dogs, Mr. Schneider got another bright idea. He decided that from his prison cell inside the shoe at Pelican Bay, he would use the money he earned in a lawsuit to purchase 2 dogs, ones like that can be seen here. And they are called Presa Canarios. They're from Spain, and they're said to be guard dogs, essentially. They were bred to be guard dogs. They're very dangerous type of dogs if put into the wrong hands. And Schneider was going to use these dogs in a breeding business. They would eventually be used in the way they're supposed to be used, as guard dogs. From what I understand, Presa Canarios are used in Spain to fight off bulls. So they're very lethal dogs if they're not cared for correctly. So again, another bright idea from Paul Schneider. And what he would ultimately do is, obviously, he could not take care of these dogs inside a box at one of the most secure prisons in California. So he would befriend a Mormon missionary that was doing volunteer work at Pelican Bay called Janet Coombs. Now, it was said that Paul Schneider kind of seductively got her involved here. It was also said by her that Schneider threatened her to, if she didn't take care of the dogs, they would have an issue. And Coombs could take care of the dogs. She had a large plot of land in Northern California, and she had livestock and all sorts of areas where the dogs could live. However, the problem that Schneider had was eventually the dogs began eating the livestock that Miss Coombs had, everything from chickens to other livestock. And she essentially told Schneider that she could no longer care for the dogs, to which that obviously bothered Schneider. But by this point, he had more willing people that he could manipulate. It's one thing we know about people in prison. They will manipulate anybody, anything from women to men to lawyers. And that's exactly what they do. They would eventually meet 2 attorneys, Robert Noel and Marjorie Noller. From what we know about these 2 individuals, they were from the East Coast. They would eventually become attorneys, and they would kind of throw away most of the high-level lawyer work that they were doing, and they began doing pro bono work at Pelican Bay. They eventually meet Paul Cornfed Schneider. Now, it has been said in evidence taken in the subsequent trial, we're going to talk about that, not only Noel, but Noller were involved in some very devious things. It was said that Noller allegedly had some sort of sexual text type relationship with Mr. Schneider, and that they were sharing messages back and forth to each other. But it was also said that eventually they would adopt Mr. Schneider as like an adoptive son and kind of take care of him. The thing, though, was Schneider was a very dangerous individual. So what he does is say, hey, I have these dogs. I need you to care for them. We would also learn, according to several publications that I've read, Miss Noel and Miss Noller, kind of confusing names, were also involved with some very devious things involving dogs, from what I understand. I'm not going to get into them, though, and I will lend them to your imagination. But Noel would regularly make very weird remarks about the dogs that they had. Now, the two dogs that Schneider had were called Bane and Hera. Now, obviously, I'm not going to go into the etymology of the names and why he chose them. But again, he was a validated AB member. He would use those names, obviously, due to that. So Schneider had a willing place for the dogs to be raised, and that was a posh San Francisco apartment building where Noel and Noller lived together. Now, again, this was really problematic because these dogs were dangerous. They were being raised to, be guard dogs. And, in some of the things that these two were allegedly doing to the dogs and that was going on inside the apartment, these dogs regularly were bothering people. Their behavior was really bad. They were attacking people in the street, biting people, just not really dogs that should be on the street. And their owners were very much not really in caring about that. It also been said that the dogs have repeatedly menaced and even bitten fellow tenants, and that Noller never muzzled them. They were reportedly leashed. However, as Noller led them down from the roof at times, they would growl, bark, and even almost be wrestled away from Noller on a regular basis. Let's take it to January 26, 2001. And this is where something really bad happens involving Noller and Bane. Now, Bane can be seen here. He's a large dog, very big dog. On that date in January of 2001, Miss Noller is leading both dogs down from the roof where she would encounter a woman seen here, Diane Whipple. Now, Diane Whipple was originally from New Jersey. She would attend college at Penn State, where she would become a two-time All-American lacrosse player, even at one point being a member of the U.S. Women's Lacrosse World Cup team. She would eventually move to San Francisco and became the lacrosse coach at St. Mary's College in Moraga, not far from San Francisco. At that point, she would live in an apartment with her partner, and they were neighbors of Mr. Noel and Miss Noller. On that day, she would encounter Bane and her owner in a stairwell. She was coming home from a grocery trip. Miss Whipple would try to unlock her apartment door while carrying 2 bags of groceries. Now, weighing more at approximately 230 pounds than Whipple and Noller combined, Bane and the other dog raced and were basically pulled away from Miss Noller. They attacked Whipple, dragging Noller behind them. The forensic evidence would show that Bane essentially did some really awful things to Miss Whipple. I can't necessarily go into some of the things, but she was bit nearly 80 times all over her body. Noller claimed that she threw herself on top of Whipple to try to save her, but her account was not supported by physical evidence, which included cuts and bites to her extremities and a torn sweatshirt sleeve, but no injuries to the parts of her body where she should have shielded Whipple. Now, police and an ambulance responded promptly to calls from 2 other residences of the building who heard Whipple scream. However, sadly, Whipple would die 70 minutes later, losing half of the blood from her body. Now, an animal control officer called Michael Scott would testify that Bane was still in such a fury when he arrived that 3 tranquilizer darts had no effect. Bane would be euthanized several days later at a San Francisco animal shelter. So Miss Whipple was essentially ripped to death. Like, I can't go into the specifics, but it was incredibly awful. And it was said that Diane Whipple, one of the people that responded to this case, said it was one of the worst things they had ever seen. At the time of her death, Diane Whipple was 33 years old. Ultimately, Miss Noller and Mr. Noel would be indicted in March of 2001 on second-degree murder and involuntary manslaughter charges. They would eventually both be convicted on involuntary manslaughter charges and served 4 years in prison. Now, what's really sad and important about this case is in the following days following the attack on Whipple, a person called David Berry, who wrote an article for the Southern Poverty Law Center, would say that both Noller and Noel made grotesque comments that essentially blamed the victim for her own death. For them, it seemed clear. Whipple's savaging was at worst an inconvenience and annoying PR problem for them. Noller would tell reporters, quote, she instructed Whipple to stay still, adding coolly that the woman would still be alive if she had done so. Now, Noel, the man, would make a thinly veiled dig at Whipple's sexual orientation, suggesting that she may have excited Bain by wearing a certain perfume, and that this claim was included in a written statement released to the media after hours after Whipple's funeral. So these people were lowlifes, real low-life people. Again, they did allegedly some really awful things in that apartment to those canines, just really ugly people. They would eventually be sentenced in the case. Now, keep in mind, down the road, Marjorie Noller would get out of prison. However, she was still facing second-degree murder charges, which she was in the process of appealing. Now, this case would go all the way to the California Supreme Court. However, the conviction, which ultimately happened of Noller, would be reinstated in 2008, and Marjorie Noller was sentenced to 15 to life in state prison after it was said and proven beyond a reasonable doubt that her malice led to the death of Danielle Whipple. So the family and friends of Whipple finally got justice. Marjorie Noller has since applied for parole multiple times, including having hearings in 2019 and 2023 as well, where she was denied in both. She will be again eligible for parole in 2026. She's currently in her late 60s. Robert Noel would die in 2018 at the age of 77 in La Jolla, California, due to heart failure. Back to Cornfed, though. He never faced charges in this case. They were his dogs. However, he was not in control of the dogs. He would say that in this case that he was regrettably sorry for what happened to Miss Whipple and that he finally decided to do something good by caring for dogs and breeding them. However, according to him, it was just bad luck as to what happened. Paul Cornfed Schneider ultimately received a third life sentence in 2003 after it was said that in 1995 he ordered the killing of Sonoma County, California Sheriff Frank Trejo at the hands of an AB member at a California rest stop. So Cornfed then had three life sentences. And at one point, he was regarded as one of the most dangerous people in the California prison system. Even at one point, it was said that he was so dangerous, he could not attend a court case. He was that dangerous. Remember, this is the same guy who stuck a defense attorney 4 times. Now, for him, his falling out with the AB would happen after, according to what we know and see, he would decide to claim that he quit the AB as a promise to his sister. However, they would decide, the AB, that he was a bad guy and an informant after he was involved in an interview he gave to Rolling Stone for an article titled Mad Dogs and Lawyers. They would look at Cornfed essentially as an informant. Now, Brian Getz, Schneider's lawyer, declined to comment on this and that he did not believe that he was an informant. However, he didn't expect the Aryan Brotherhood to buy it. The gang didn't like the article. They were pissed about it, Schneider would say. To make matters worse, he would be transferred to a federal prison in Missouri for a leg issue. that would fuel suspicion that Cornfed was acting as a federal informant and working against the Aryan Brotherhood. The truth of the matter is, he is a dropout and he is not recognized by the AB anymore. So for the foreseeable future and the rest of his life, he will have to fear retribution by the Aryan Brotherhood inside prison. Paul Schneider will never get out of prison. He is currently 62 years old, and I have no idea where he currently is. He is in the BOP system. However, from what I understand, he was released and given to California as far as his confinement. He's not in BOP custody. When I looked him up in the California Department of Corrections website, he is not, there's no place given as to where he is. So he's in secret being housed somewhere. We don't know where that is. I want to, though, go to what our pal Sammy Gravano would say about Cornfed. He would say that he would meet Cornfed inside the ADX sometime in the 2000s after Gravano was involved in that ecstasy scam and selling down in Arizona. He would say that he'd eventually meet Cornfed through the prison pipe system, where he eventually was kind of in a cell caddied to where Mr. Gravano was. He would say that they began just kind of talking, and eventually Gravano and him decided to go out on the yard together at ADX Florence. Eventually, Gravano claims to have an issue with some guy, a shot caller in the Dirty White Boys, who was also a dropout, according to what we know. Sammy then claims that he and Cornfed conspired to whack this Dirty White Boy and that they were going to do it. The only thing that happened was, surprisingly, the day they were going to do it, this Dirty White Boy decided to snitch to the feds, and they then decided they weren't going to do it. And that Sammy claims that if that didn't happen, he would be serving life right now because he had no problem whacking some random Dirty White Boy, even though Sammy had just become the largest rat in the history of the mafia, and that he did all that just to go to prison to whack some random gang member. Makes sense, doesn't it? Look, I've always said I don't buy this story. Look, has he maybe met Cornfed? Probably. Now, also in another interview or another video that Sammy's done called "What Do My Tattoos Mean?", he claims that he has a tattoo of Odin, the god of war, and that the Aryan Brotherhood allegedly approved Sammy to get the tattoo, even though the tattoo is never given to any non-member of the AB. Understand, though, the people that gave approval for this are no longer members of the AB and are not recognized due to the fact that they are dropouts and wanted for death by the brand. Which is weird, too, because Sammy Gravano has a granddaughter that's half black. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Why would you befriend members of the Aryan Brotherhood? Just completely bizarre, in my opinion. Do I think Cornfed and Sammy... Look, I probably think Cornfed would whack that guy. But, like, Sammy Gravano, let's remember, this is the same guy who takes credit for 19 murders. As we know, and we did a video on, Sammy didn't actually pull the trigger in any of those. Actually, it was only 2, and they were both very early in his career. One of Joe Colucci and one of Alan Kaiser, who was a teenager. So as we know, Sammy Gravano is not the hardcore assassin that he claims to be. But he claims at that point he just didn't give a shit, and he was willing to do what he had to do. But that conveniently, the Dirty White Boy that they were going to whack disappeared, and he cooperated. So that's that. Again, though, there is one thing we know about Cornfed. He's a very dangerous individual, and luckily there are prisons that are made to prevent us from people like him. We talk a lot about places like the ADX. Are they necessary in our society? I've heard from a certain inmate, and obviously not directly to me, but he would tell the media that places like the ADX are for people like him, and they prevent society from having to deal with people like him, people like Cornfed. Cornfed, a crazy story. It's just that simple. But I wanted to tell you a little bit more about him because we've heard a lot about him over the years. I hope you enjoyed this video. Let me know what you think of it in the comment section below. We'll see you next week here on The Sit Down.